Good morning, Word of Life family and friends. Welcome to the Sunday School class for April 19th, 2020. We're going to be in the book of Esther this morning, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, fairly short lesson. You can follow along if you have your books. If you don't have a book, don't worry about it. You don't need it. It's like I said, it's a pretty well-known story. With that, we'll move on. Our lesson context, and I just made this real simple. An orphaned Jewish from the tribe of Benjamin becomes queen and saves her people. That's kind of the story, and that's what we're going to get into. The book of Esther is one of those books that we don't know a great deal about. Some of the books in the Bible, we can actually look at them, and there's so much information from different historical perspectives and whatnot. But this is one that we don't really know a great deal about. We're really not even sure who wrote it. There are those that believe that it was written by Mordecai, which is entirely possible. But there's others that believe that maybe Ezra or maybe even Nehemiah wrote it. And again, we don't really know. We don't even know when it was written. It was someplace between 460 and 350 BC is about as close as we can narrow it down. But we do know that the king that we're going to be talking about, King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus or something like that. We know that his reign was 485 to 465 BC, and that's something that we glean from history. And so, but it's a very interesting story, and so let's move on. So let me give you a little bit more perspective on this, but I'll have this up so you can see where we're starting. Esther was orphaned, and she was raised actually by Mordecai. He was acting as her father, but he was actually her cousin. And so they ended up in this Persian city of Susa. The king really liked to imbibe. I mean, he liked to throw a few back. It's very clear if you read the entire book of Esther that he liked his wine. And he ended up getting rid of his first wife. And you can read about that if you like. It's a short book, so easy to read. And then they had sort of a beauty pageant to see who was going to be the next queen. And Mordecai encouraged Esther to be part of that. And of course, she got picked. So it's a fairly easy assumption to say that she must have been very beautiful because the king was in love with her, obviously. But somehow during all of this, one other thing happened. There was a plot to overthrow the king, and Mordecai had found out about it and relayed that information to Esther. And then the king was told, and he investigated and found out, yes, in fact, there was a plot to overthrow him. And of course, the people that were involved got hanged. And Mordecai had a favor with the king, as did Esther. And so this guy, Haman, who was the king's right-hand man, was really upset with the Jews in their area. And he developed a plot to get rid of them, to murder, to kill them all, especially Mordecai. He did not like Mordecai at all, and he was he was high on the hit list. And of course, they found out about it, and Mordecai got word to Esther. And, at this time, she couldn't just barge right in to the king and just talk to him. That's not how things were done. They had an order to the way things were done back then. So what she did was she decided to throw this banquet and invite the king and Haman, and that's where we are. So in verse 1 it says, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet." So in verse 2 it says, "And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, as they were drinking wine on the second day, and the king again asked her, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." So obviously the king wasn't messing around. He knew that she wanted something. She made that clear. And so he offered her whatever she wanted. All she had to do was ask. So we're not entirely sure if the king knew that his queen was a Jew. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't think he really cared one way or the other. But we pick up in verse 3, and it says, "Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." Okay, so now it just kind of got real. And the king was starting to understand something. He didn't really know the whole story, but now it's really starting to make sense to him. And so she goes on to explain it a little further in verse 4. It says, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." So now she's pretty much laid it out for the king, and then we'll see how he responds. So in verse 5, he asked her a question. And it says, "King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing." It's interesting that he's the one that gave the decree, but it's been probably a few weeks since that happened. He seems to be kind of clueless about the whole situation, but now he's obviously upset, and he wants to know what's going on. So in verse 6, the queen responds. Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Now she named him. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen, as well he should be, because this king this definitely had a reputation for not messing around, and he's been drinking wine all afternoon, so who knows what can happen. But it's not looking good for our boy Haman, I can tell you that. So this brings us to verse 7. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Yeah, I would be begging for my life too. This dude already knew he was in trouble, and the king now knew something as well, and that is that Haman had really put his own interest above that of the king's interest, and that wasn't his job or his place in life. And so now the king is extremely upset. So in verse 8, it says, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Um, so back in these days, they had these sort of almost like a bed, uh, more like a bed than a couch. They weren't using tables, so that when you had a royal feast or banquet, you could recline really easily. They're calling it a couch. It wasn't really, but that doesn't really matter. And then it says, the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. It's interesting that Haman was now bowing or begging the queen for his life. When one of the things that started this whole business is the fact that Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. He just wouldn't do it, and that's one of the things that upset Haman and made him have a desire to go kill all the Jews, especially Mordecai. He really didn't like that guy at all because he wouldn't bow, but now he's, in essence, groveling for his life to the queen. So in verse 9, it says, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. And the king said, impale him on it. It's interesting that the queen had some of the king's eunuchs kind of in her corner. She really had established relationships with them, and they were fairly loyal to her. And so we see that the moment all this happens, this dude speaks up and kind of snitches off Mordecai because he had set this thing up because he wanted to make a public spectacle out of Mordecai. And so then the king said, well, then let's use it for him. So that's what's about to happen. In verse 10 it says, so they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So that was the end of Haman. And it seems like it was fairly swift and immediate. And he was made a public spectacle on the very thing that he intended for Mordecai to suffer. It says he was impaled. There is a little controversy here. It's really probably not worth mentioning, but in some places it says he's impaled, like NIV, which is what we're using today. The King James says he was hanged. It kind of doesn't really matter. It was not a good death, and that's the way it is. And also, the other cool thing about this is the king had given a signet ring to Haman, which he took back, and he now gave it to Mordecai, and Mordecai was now promoted and took Haman's job. So that was a pretty cool thing. So in conclusion, there's a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes. This was orchestrated about as perfectly as it could be. One of the things that the lesson just kind of glances over, and I think is highly important, and it comes from Esther 4, when Mordecai tells Esther that she needs to go talk to the king and expose this. And he pointed out to her that perhaps the reason she was here overall, he said, perhaps you were created for such a time as this, for such a time as this. And I think A lot of us, perhaps we were created for such a time as this. But like I said, there was a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes. Um, and it just all came together pretty perfectly. And Esther indeed did save all of her people. Um, and the Jewish people to this day still celebrate that. There is a Jewish holiday called Purim, and that celebrates Esther saving the Jewish people. Uh, it's very interesting that there's been in the Old Testament several people that Jews that rose to prominence and found favor. And I mean, you can look story after story: Joseph, Nehemiah. There's a ton of them. So it's pretty cool, and I think Esther was one of those people. So our prayer for today is, Father, open our eyes to the opportunities you have for us. Give us courage to act even when we don't know your plans. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Our thought to remember, act justly in every situation. And finally, this brings us to, what do you think? And the question is posed, where might God be calling you to speak up for justice on behalf of others? That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself. I want to say thanks so much for joining us this week. Probably a little shorter than normal, but it's a short story. Great story, though. Tune in next week. We'll have another lesson for you, and we'll get through this. And hopefully, in the next few weeks, I'm hoping that we can actually get back to our normal routine, because I love our interactive Sunday school. It's way better than this, but this is way better than nothing. So we'll see y'all soon, and God bless you.